For the purpose of this post, I'm going to be talking about 3 common themes that I saw across the texts, and as I go, I'll be inserting in some of my personal experiences and connections that I have to those themes. Apple's 1978 text questions how inequalities are being maintained via educational reforms that are at the same time benefiting specific subgroups. The text also provides us with some strategies to critically deal with these questions. Apple's 2007 text takes a look at the ideological assumptions behind No Child Left Behind. In doing so, the text also highlights the very odd culmination of both marketization and centralization in public education. Baltodano's 2012 text assesses how neoliberalism has kind of restructured public education to further corporate goals of just producing more of a workforce with technical skills and functional skills. At the same time, the text provides us with some action steps towards preventing further degradation of public education. So I'm now going to briefly look at 3 themes that I saw across all texts. All texts called for a more critical examination of public education and the reforms taking place across the field. They call for replacing an ahistorical examination of reforms and educational practices to a contextualized one. Apple proposes that while the public does acknowledge the social construction of reality, we fail to critically reflect on how and why it's constructed, how certain constructions become dominant while others do not, and then finally, how all of that influences and impacts education reform. This should sound extremely familiar to us from last week's book, Silencing the Past, where we shifted our focus from not what is history, but how is history constructed, why is it constructed in certain ways, and how are dominant narratives accepted while others are not. Apple points out that 2 primary research traditions, the academic achievement model and the socialization approach, both have limitations in this regard. The former, in its lack of attention on the content itself, fails to consider the connection between economics and the structure of school knowledge. The latter, while exploring norms and values in schools, ignores how certain values becoming dominant across education public spheres happens. So Apple is actually a proponent of a 3rd research tradition called sociology of school knowledge. And this actually seeks to inquire into those things and contextualize them and not keep them ahistorical. Apple's 2007 text similarly asks us to engage in a more critical examination of public education and reforms taking place across the field. Apple argues that the United States' lack of critical examination of conservative discourse has prevented the public from realizing the progressive language used in many reforms efforts mask deeper neoliberal agendas. Liberal discourses are being appropriated and repurposed. A lack of critical analysis across such instances provide the opportunity for the advancements of neoliberal and neoconservative ideology. Consequently, this leads to further perpetuation of inequality. We see yet another call for critical reflection in Apple's 2007 text, when he questions why the U.S. is not having dialogue about how other nations have experienced the collide between market culture and accountability culture. We have blindly implemented this self-contradicting system that at one time wants to implement high accountability and monitoring while also including free market practices. We've done so without seeking advice or looking at the perspectives of other nations, but this is likely just because those in power would then have to face the faults in their ideologies. Baltodano also calls for a critical examination of education and its reforms in replacement of an ahistorical and uncritical examination. Baltodano proposes a collective vision for social justice and the restructuring of public education that in itself requires teachers and students to think deeply and critically about socio-political issues. To achieve this human development paradigm, critical examinations of current public education and reforms must take place. The author lists many specific examples of such practices as recommended action steps for students, teachers, parents, and community groups. We are asked to reflect on the role of unions, the structuring of school boards, and continually evaluate education as a whole. Baltodano also puts into practice historically contextualized examinations of education and critical examinations of education. This can be seen in the methodologies of his study. He pulls from texts including social movements, historical documents, speeches, field notes, all to contextualize his critical evaluation of current education and educational reform. And I think it's worth noting that this theme is very closely related to something that we read about in last week's book, Silencing the Past, and that's the idea of an authentic engagement with history. To authentically and purposefully engage with history is to critically reflect on the present in relation to our past. It is also becoming self-aware of and reflective on how we actively participate as witness, actors, and commenters in the current production of history. These questions are not taking place in regards to education reform and curriculum. So another concept found across all texts is that conservative and neoliberal reforms are being masked by appropriated liberal terminologies. For example, some argue that school voucher and school choice programs, which seek to establish educational equality, are in fact expressions of coloniality of power and systematic racism in modern American society. It is very minimally seen in Apple's 1978 text, but I do argue that there's a connection there. Apple argues that we're failing to ask who benefits from certain educational policies and reforms, and we're not inquiring into how those perpetuate inequalities. It's my view that we're not asking these questions because such policies and reforms are masked with that terminology of liberalism, of multiculturalism, of social justice, despite their neoliberal intent. Apple's 2007 article just directly states this concept and highlights for readers that educational policies and acts are pushing forward neoliberal agendas by repurposing progressive language. Apple states proposals that seemingly lead to reforms that are wanted by the least powerful actors in society are largely used to gain legitimacy for very different kinds of agendas. This quote perfectly articulates what I see happening with the FAST certification tracks and the standardization of the PACT test. Baltodano discusses how both the fast track certification programs and the PACT test are pushed forward by underlying neoliberal agendas. A problem is being presented to the public in very progressive language regarding how schools of education are not properly preparing teachers to help differentiate instructions for students and how they're not ensuring student success. So in walks the PACT test, and this is going to help students and solve students' problems and work for the student and ensure that they are being given adequately prepared teachers. This seemingly helps the masses and those with less power while furthering the neoliberal agenda of standardizing education in a way that will help increase those technical skills of the workforce. This kind of smoothly transitions us into the next concept or theme that I saw across all texts, and that is how schools are transitioning into production sites for a technically skilled labor force. Apple's 1978 article asserts that a corporate economy does not function best with a widespread distribution of high-status knowledge, but rather it needs to produce vast amounts of technical knowledge to be profitable. Thus, we see institutions naturally generating low achievement and providing the most funding to technical areas of the curriculum. In this way, a very clear connection can be seen between economics and education. The public education system is structured to serve and maintain the economic system. It is a production site for an adequate workforce equipped with specific skill sets to further the corporate economy. This is highly reflected in what I'm seeing in my own district. We have a track for CTE. We have over 50 different credentials and certifications that students can acquire before going directly into the workforce or going directly into an apprenticeship. We also have a STEM track where students go up to our university that's in the area. They're working in STEM skills, they're working in CTE technical skills, and there are no such tracks for the liberal arts. Apple's 2007 article is again much more direct, much more straight to the point, and just flat out says it. We are selling both our children and our schools. The commodification of public education is the primary topic of that article. The article highlights this using the topic of No Child Left Behind and how standardization has shifted schools from not a site of critical thinking, but a site of producing a new labor force or a more equipped labor force with technical skills. Baltodano sings the same song, but puts it in more of a historical context. Most notably, Baltodano hones in on how in the 1980s, criticism against the education system was most notably regarding how it was not helping or responding to the economic needs of society. Thus, just like we've seen explained in the other articles, schools moved from critical thinking to the economically advantageous functional skills. There are two more concluding comments that I wanted to make that are just kind of outside the realm of those common themes and concepts from across the texts.
Apple states that cultural capital stored in schools acts as an effective filtering device in the reproduction of a hierarchical society.
In our own schools, we see this cultural capital in the form of hidden curriculum, but it's becoming more and more less hidden every day. I know a lot of us have been using PBIS, systems like Minga or Hero or the system PBIS in general, to reward students with points for positive behaviors or the manifestations of cultural capital that we're looking for. How this cultural capital is equivalent to economic capital is also highly evident in today's society, where networking and social skills and social exchanges are a big part of how you advance yourself in your career. Lastly, to end this discussion video post, I want to briefly just share a train of critical thought that I had when I was reading Apple's 1978 text. I think that my train of thought and how I arrived to further comprehending the argument in that text just is slightly useful.
Apple stated that, "We shall have to recognize that, like poverty, poor achievement is not an aberration. Both poverty and curricular problems, such as low achievement, are integral products of the organization of economic, cultural, and social life." I interpreted this as an acknowledgement that dominant cultural values, which become cultural capital, are contributing to inequality. While this may be true, unless no behaviors, knowledge, skills, and culture are seen as being superior to others, it will continue to be true, regardless of whatever type of cultural value becomes dominant and commodified as capital. Human tendency in nature is to organize ourselves into social groups that subscribe to communal norms. So we can criticize this all we want, but is there an alternative that lends itself to our human nature without being in contradiction of it?
And then just one page later, as I'm reading, Apple reminds me that what I'm asking is not the point at all, and he directly addresses my train of thought.
Apple argues that thinking about this can lend to a rather vulgar brand of relativism. But the point is not to find an alternative to the entire structure of education. It is simply to think critically and contextually about education and its reforms. This can hopefully lend itself to more authentic political engagement that can become activism in the current system.